The candle guttered as Nell descended the last step. She had not meant to find it. She had meant only to carry the warming pan to the small linen closet at the east end of the servants' corridor, the one with the broken latch that required a shoulder against the frame, and a prayer, and to return to her pallet before the household bell rang again. It was past midnight. The great house of Ashford Park breathed around her in that particular way old houses breathed at night, settling into their own weight, the oak paneling contracting with the cold, the portraits on the upper gallery absorbing the dark as though they had always expected it. She had been pressing her shoulder to the linen closet door when the wall had moved. Not the door. The wall. A seam she had taken for a shadow, a line she had catalogued unconsciously over 5 months of passing this corridor with a tray or a basket or a pail, had parted. The panel had swung inward on some mechanism she could not yet name, and the air that breathed out from behind it carried cold and leaf damp, and something she could not immediately identify, something mineral and old. Stone. The smell of stone not visited in daylight. Nell Hargrove stood very still. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a curate who had spent her childhood surrounded by books, and the daughter of a woman who had spent hers surrounded by worry. And she was intelligent enough to understand that what lay behind the wall was not her business, and careful enough to understand that the fact of discovering it might become her business, whether she wished it or not. Behind her, the great house slept. Ahead, the passage breathed its cold breath. She had taken 1 step inside before she heard the sound of footsteps returning. The Duchess of Ashford did not know she had been seen. That much Nell understood as she pressed herself flat against the stone and listened to the soft tread of her mistress retreating up the passage, felt the brush of cold air as the woman passed within 3 feet of her in the dark without pausing, heard the panel shut behind her with a small, precise click. The Duchess was composed. She was always composed. That was the thing the household had learned to say about her in the first weeks of Nell's service, spoken in the particular tone that meant something more than the words. Her Grace is always composed. It was not a compliment, Nell had understood. It was a form of awe, with an underside of unease. She had not moved for 3 full minutes after the Duchess was gone. Then she had walked back to her pallet and lain in the dark until dawn. And not until she rose and washed her face in cold water and saw her own eyes in the cracked glass above the washstand did she understand what the recognition settling behind her ribs actually was. Not fear. Obligation. If you are still finding your way into this story, stay with me. What Nell chose to do with what she had found would come to matter to more people than herself. She had been at Ashford Park for 5 months by the night of the panel. She had arrived in April when the estate grounds were still brown from a hard winter, hired as a lady's maid to replace a woman called Mrs. Greer, who had left without notice in a manner that the housekeeper, Mrs. Potts, alluded to only in the architecture of silence around the subject. The position had been arranged through her father's former patron, a clergyman in Derbyshire who had written to the Duke's household on her behalf, after the curate's death, had left Nell and her younger sister Cecily without income and without the small rectory they had called home. The hire had been practical, not generous. Lady Ashford, the Duke's mother, had made the terms clear at the interview. The household did not welcome familiarity. The household did not welcome questions, and the household expected absolute discretion. The Duke himself she had seen precisely twice before the night of the panel. Both times in passing, once in the entrance hall, and once at the far end of the south gallery. And both times the word that had arranged itself in her mind was that same word. Still. Not cold, not proud, not distant, though he was all of those things too if you looked at him through the lens the household provided. Still in the way, a body is still. When it is absorbing something it cannot show. The Duke of Ashford, James Elliot, was 34 years old and had been widowed for 2 years, and the household did not speak of the late Duchess in front of the present one. The present Duchess of Ashford was Lady Ashford's selection. She had been Lady Catherine born before her marriage 6 months ago, the younger daughter of an earl, 25 years old, dark-haired, meticulous in her deportment, and universally admired by everyone in the household who was required to admire her. Mrs. Potts was cautious in her praise, choosing her words with the care of someone sweeping a floor they suspected was rotted underneath. The footmen were formal. The kitchen staff were silent on the subject. Nell, who had been hired as the Duchess's own maid, was the person closest to her mistress, and she had learned over 5 months to read her grace the way one reads weather, attending to signs rather than declarations. The signs, taken together, had begun to make a pattern Nell could not name. The Duchess retired early, always, at 9:30, and the dismissal was firm. She did not require her maid after 10 in any case. She did not require assistance with correspondence, which she managed herself. She did not receive callers in her apartments. She slept, she told Mrs. Potts, very lightly, and the household accommodated her stated sensitivity with the usual small courtesies. She did not sleep. Nell had suspected it for weeks before the passage. She had not investigated it. That was not her place, and she was not a fool. She had simply noted the way the Duchess's eyes in the morning carried the quality of someone who had been occupied, not rested. The way a woman who has been reading in secret looks different from a woman who has slept. She had noted the small mud marks on the hem of the indoor slippers that no route inside Ashford Park could have produced. She had noted, and she had continued her work. And she had said nothing. Because servants who said things rarely remained servants for long. The morning after the panel, the Duke of Ashford asked to see her. It was not unheard of for the master of the house to speak to a member of staff directly. Nell had known it to happen, under the usual formal conditions, in the drawing room with the housekeeper present. What was unusual was the hour. He sent his man Crane to the servants' hall at 7 in the morning, before breakfast was finished, before the day's work had properly sorted itself into its usual arrangements, and Crane had said, with the particular expressionlessness that indicated something the speaker had decided not to feel, that His Grace wished to speak with Miss Hargrove at her earliest convenience. Which meant now. She had set down her tea and followed. The Duke's study was at the north end of the house, a room that faced the kitchen gardens and the gray stone of the old chapel wall, and received the morning light in a cool, impersonal way that suited it. He was standing at the window when she entered, not seated, his hands clasped behind his back, and he did not turn immediately. She had a moment to observe him. He was tall, broader across the shoulders than his formality suggested, in a coat of dark charcoal wool over a white cravat that had been tied with precision, and nothing else. His hair was dark and not quite orderly. His face, when he turned, was the face she had catalogued from the hall and the gallery. Strong jaw, a faint crease between the brows that was not a frown, so much as a habitual attention, eyes that were gray and watching. He looked at her the way she had noticed, in those 2 prior sightings, that he tended to look at things that required his genuine consideration. Steadily, without the performative gravity that she had learned to expect from men who wished to appear serious. He was simply paying attention. "Miss Hargrove," he said. His voice was low and level. "I am told you have been in Her Grace's service since April." "Yes, Your Grace." "Are you satisfied in your position?" It was not the question she had expected. She took a brief moment to ensure her answer was accurate. "I am, Your Grace." He was quiet. He turned back to the window, looked at the kitchen gardens, the frost still white at the base of the far wall. She waited. "My wife," he said, "is a woman with concerns she does not share." Nell said nothing. He had not asked her a question. "I do not ask you to betray a confidence," he said, still to the window. "I would not put you in that position. I ask only this. If you become aware of anything that places Her Grace in risk of harm, I would ask you to come to me directly. Not to my mother. To me." The distinction was notable. Nell noted it. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. He turned then, and the attention in his gray eyes shifted into something that was not quite the look he had given the garden, something fractionally less controlled. And then it was gone. He was composed again. Like his wife, she thought. And then she thought, no, not like his wife. Not like his wife at all. "That will be all," he said. She did not tell him about the passage. She told herself it was because she did not yet know what the passage meant, and that was true. She told herself it was because she could not speak of what she had not been asked, and that was also true, in its way. The third reason she did not examine until later. The passage ran from the servants' east corridor to the old chapel. She found this out on the second night she entered it, 7 days after the first, with a better candle and less panic. It was not a secret in the architectural sense, she realized. It was merely forgotten. The mechanism on the servant's side was a small wooden block, set flush with the paneling at waist height, invisible unless you knew to press it, and on the chapel side the door opened behind the vestment chest in the small robing room off the nave. The passage itself was perhaps 40 feet of unplastered stone, low-ceilinged, cold as a larder, smelling of the mineral damp she had identified on the first night. Someone had built it with purpose, and no one had used it for a generation. No one except the Duchess. What the Duchess was doing in the old chapel at night was a question that arranged itself with a clarity that felt almost too simple once Nell had sat with it. The chapel had not been in regular use since the death of the previous Duke 8 years prior. His Grace, the current Duke, was not, by the household's quiet reckoning, a man who took comfort in formal religion. The chapel contained something the main house did not: the grave. Not in the chapel itself, but in the small walled churchyard attached to it, accessible through a low door in the north transept wall. And in that churchyard, in a plot set slightly apart from the older stones, the previous Duchess of Ashford lay buried. Elizabeth Elliot, dead these 2 years, wife to James. The stone was simple. Nell had seen it once in daylight on an errand to the gardener's cottage. The dates were young. The inscription was 4 words. The current Duchess of Ashford was visiting the grave of her predecessor. Nell sat with this for 3 days before she understood what it meant. It was not grief. The Duchess had not known Elizabeth Elliot. It was not morbid curiosity in the ordinary sense. The Duchess was too precise, too deliberate, too systematic in her use of the passage for it to be the product of a disordered mind. She went on Tuesdays and Fridays, Nell had established. She was gone between 1 hour and 90 minutes. She came back with something in her expression that Nell could only describe as resolution, the look of a woman who has checked something and found it consistent with what she believed. She was, Nell slowly understood, verifying something. The question was what? She had been an attentive lady's maid for 5 months. She had folded her mistress's letters into their envelopes without reading them, which was her duty. She had dressed her Grace's hair, maintained her wardrobe, carried her messages to Crane and the housekeeper, and kept every confidence that had been given to her, which were not many, because the Duchess did not confide. She had observed, though. She had observed the letters that arrived sealed and departed sealed, and the ones that seemed to cost her mistress something. She had observed the way the Duchess spoke to the Duke, correctly, formally, with the careful distance of two people maintaining an agreed-upon architecture. She had observed, once, the Duke pausing at the door of his wife's sitting room, his hand flat on the frame, his head slightly bowed, for a full minute before he turned and walked away without entering. She had not understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now. The truth, when it assembled itself in its full shape in Nell's mind on a Thursday morning in November, while she was pressing the Duchess's morning gown, was this. The Duchess of Ashford did not believe her predecessor had died of fever. She had not said this to anyone. She had not asked questions. She had not consulted the household or the Duke or his mother. She was a woman of 24 conducting a solitary inquiry by the only means available to her, which was to visit the grave of the woman she had replaced, and to search, in some discipline Nell could not quite read, for what the stone could not give her. The Earl's daughter, hired to protect an earldom's alliance with the Ashford title, had arrived at Ashford Park 6 months ago and found something in the house that had not been disclosed to her, and she was working through it alone. Nell set down the gown. She had promised the Duke she would come to him if his wife were in risk of harm. She had understood that to mean physical harm, the kind a lady might come to by wandering at night in a great old house. She had not understood it to include the harm that came from a woman carrying alone what should not be carried alone. She thought now that it might. She went to him that afternoon. She asked to speak with him privately. Crane, well-trained, found a reason to withdraw. She stood before the Duke in the study for the second time, and this time, when he turned from the window, his attention was immediate and different from the week before. The fraction of relief visible for exactly 1 instant before it was absorbed back into composure. She told him about the passage. She told him about the chapel and the churchyard. She told him what she had deduced about why. She was careful, precise, and plain, because she respected him enough not to soften it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "How long?" he said at last. "Have you known?" 8 days of knowing with certainty, Nell said. 7 weeks of suspicion? The gray eyes found her face. "You said nothing for 7 weeks." "It was not my place to speak without being sure." "Your Grace." "It was also not my place to speak what I could not prove. I have only recently become certain." He turned away from her, to the window. The kitchen gardens were iron gray and frost white in the November noon. She watched the line of his shoulders, the stillness she had catalogued twice before, and understood now that the stillness was not composure in the way his wife's composure was composure. His was the stillness of a man absorbing a blow. "She believes," he said quietly, not quite to her, "that I concealed something." It was not a question. Nell did not answer it. "She is not wrong that Elizabeth's death was not as it appeared," he said. The words were level and careful, and cost him something she could see in the set of his jaw. "It was not what my wife fears. It was not what I might fear if I were in her position. It was a failure of medicine, and a great deal of misplaced guilt that I have spent 2 years becoming unable to speak of." He stopped. The garden held its frost. "I did not tell my wife, because I did not know how to tell her without sounding as though I were making a case for my own innocence, which is precisely what a guilty man would also do." Nell stood very still. "You are a woman of some intelligence," he said, turning back. The gray eyes were direct and unguarded in a way they had not been before, and she understood she was seeing something the household rarely saw. "What would you advise?" She looked at him. She thought about the Duchess at a grave in the cold, systematic and solitary, verifying what she feared. She thought about the Duke at the door he had not opened. She thought about the architecture two careful people had built between themselves out of the materials, silence, and distance, which were not good building materials, which always eventually gave way. "Tell her," Nell said. "Tonight. Not through Crane, and not through a letter, and not through a third party. Go to her room and tell her everything. Your Grace. She will not forgive the silence easily. She may not forgive it for some time. She cannot begin to trust what she has not been given." Something shifted in his face. Not relief, not ease. Something quieter and more difficult. The look of a man recognizing a thing he had known and refused. "That is quite direct," he said. "You asked for my counsel, Your Grace. I am a curate's daughter. We tend toward directness." There was a long pause. Then something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile, and was the closest she had seen him come to one. A brief and involuntary easing of the severity that changed his face entirely for the space of a second, and then was gone. "So I see," he said. He did not dismiss her immediately. He looked at her for a moment in the particular way she had begun to understand was not the way he looked at things that required his professional consideration, and she felt the warmth in her face before she had decided whether to acknowledge it. The small involuntary register of the body reporting something the mind had not yet formally admitted. She excused herself. She did not tell herself it meant nothing. She was too intelligent for that. She told herself it was not relevant, which was closer to the truth, or at least closer to what she needed it to be. He went to the Duchess that night. Nell knew because she heard the knock at her Grace's door from her pallet in the adjoining room. Heard the pause. Heard the door open. Heard nothing after that because what happened next was not hers to hear. The Duchess did not use the passage on Friday. She did not use it the following Tuesday either. What she was not doing, Nell had concluded, she was doing with the Duke instead. She was no longer doing alone. The change in the house was not dramatic. The household would not have recognized it as change. The forms of address were the same. The formal courtesies the same. The arrangement of meals and mornings, and the management of the estate calendar the same. The door to the Duchess's sitting room was opened twice in the following week, when it had never been opened before. The Duke was observed by Crane to have sent for a pot of tea to be brought to his wife's rooms in the afternoon, which was unusual enough that Crane mentioned it to Nell without any particular awareness that he was disclosing information she already understood. And Lady Ashford, the Duke's mother, who had spent 6 months positioning herself as the primary authority in the household, and who had selected the current Duchess for reasons that had nothing to do with whether her son might come to value her, began to find that her invitations to the morning room were met with polite regrets. Lady Ashford, whose name was Margaret, and who was 61, and who had run Ashford Park according to her own understanding of what it required since her husband's death, noticed everything. She noticed the changed tenor of the small domestic arrangements. She noticed that her son spoke to his wife with an attention that had not been present before. She noticed, with the sharpest attention, that the lady's maid who had been hired on a clergyman's recommendation had apparently acquired some unusual access to her son's private counsel. She requested Nell's presence in the morning room on the 18th of November. Nell arrived to find her ladyship seated in her great chair with a china cup and the specific posture she used for occasions she intended to manage. Lady Ashford was a handsome woman who wore her authority as other women wore their best jewels, with an awareness of effect and a practiced ease. She had never spoken to Nell directly before. "I hear my son has been consulting his wife's maid on domestic matters," Lady Ashford said. The dismissal in the phrase was precise and deliberate, the reduction complete. The implication was plain. A servant's place was service, and a servant who had forgotten, that was a servant who required correction. Nell had expected something like this. She had given it thought. She said carefully, "His Grace was kind enough to ask for my observations, my lady. As someone in close attendance on her Grace, I gave him what I could." "You are a lady's maid," Lady Ashford said, "not a confidant." "Yes, my lady." "You would do well to remember the distinction." Lady Ashford set down her cup with the small precision that was her signature gesture, the one that ended conversations. "My son has a generous regard for those who serve him well. It would be a pity if a well-intentioned young woman misread the nature of that regard. It was a warning and a threat, and a kindness all at once, delivered in the voice of a woman who believed she was acting in her son's interest." Nell understood all of it. She also understood what it cost Lady Ashford to deliver it. Not much. She was a woman whose script had worked in every other situation she had encountered. She had every reason to believe it would work here. "Yes, my lady," Nell said. "Thank you, my lady." She withdrew with perfect propriety and said nothing to anyone. The following week was quiet. The household turned toward Christmas. Nell went about her work. She dressed her Grace's hair and maintained the wardrobe and carried messages and kept her own counsel, and she noted, without permitting herself to dwell on the noting, that the Duke passed through the corridor outside the servants' hall twice on days when there was no practical reason for him to be on that side of the house, and that on the second occasion he had paused for a fraction of a second when he passed the open door through which she was visible at her work, and had walked on without speaking, and that she had been aware, for the rest of that day, of an attention she could neither identify nor reasonably dismiss. She was not a fool. She was also not a woman who permitted herself fool's hopes. She had a younger sister in a Derbyshire boarding house whose quarterly fees were paid from Nell's wages. She had a position that was good by any practical measure and depended entirely on the house's continued approval. She had sense enough to know that a duke who found a curate's daughter unexpectedly useful was not a duke who had moved the furniture of his life around to accommodate what that implied. She told herself all of this with precision, lying on her pallet at night, and she believed all of it. And it made no difference whatsoever to the fact of her body's precise and involuntary awareness of where he was in any room they shared. The Duchess found out on the 1st of December. Not through any failure of Nell's. She had been in the library retrieving a book her Grace had asked for, and had not noticed the Duchess entering from the east door until she turned to find her mistress standing very still in the center of the room, regarding her with an expression that was unusual on a face trained to reveal nothing. Recognition, complicated and unfinished. "You told him?" the Duchess said. "Not accusatory, simply establishing a fact." Nell stood with the book in her hands. There was no useful dissembling available. "Yes, Your Grace." The Duchess looked at her for a long moment. "You could have told his mother." "Yes, Your Grace." "Why did you not?" Nell considered the question. It was a genuine one. She gave it a genuine answer. "Because his mother would have used what I gave her to manage his Grace, and what you needed was not to be managed. You needed to be told the truth. Only he could give you that." The Duchess was quiet for some time. The library held its candlelight. Outside, December was making itself felt in the quality of the air at the window glass. "You are," said her Grace at last, "surprisingly difficult to dislike, Miss Hargrove." "I am told it is a curate's daughter quality, Your Grace." Something moved in the Duchess's face. Something that was not the composure Nell had learned over 5 months to read as weather. Something warmer and less managed. "Yes," she said softly. "I expect it is." She did not dismiss her. She sat down unexpectedly in one of the leather chairs by the fireplace in a posture Nell had never seen her assume. Not formal, not arranged. She sat as a woman sits when she has decided to stop performing. "I am not yet certain what to do with what he told me," she said. "I want you to know that I am not angry at you for the part you played. Whatever is between my husband and myself is old and tangled and has almost nothing to do with you." She paused. "Almost?" Nell said nothing. "You should know," the Duchess said, looking at her steadily, "that I have eyes, Miss Hargrove. I have always had eyes." The warmth in Nell's face arrived before she could prevent it. She held perfectly still. "That is not a threat," the Duchess said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not my mother-in-law." Something passed through her expression, drier and more human than anything she had shown in 5 months. "I simply think you should know that you are not invisible. In this house, with this man, you are not invisible at all." There was nothing appropriate to say. Nell said quietly, "Thank you, Your Grace." She meant it. The matter did not resolve itself neatly. It did not, Nell reflected later, resolve itself with the tidy architecture of a story that had been planned. The Duke did not speak of what his wife had said. The Duchess did not reference their library conversation again. Christmas came to Ashford Park, and the household performed its usual rituals. The greenery hung, the kitchens expanded. The tenants received in the great hall for the usual afternoon, with its cold meats and its carefully managed conviviality. Lady Ashford presided. The Duke stood slightly apart, as was his manner, present and watchful and contained. But on the 23rd of December, he came to the servants' east corridor himself, at 3 in the afternoon, when Nell was alone there mending a glove by the window light, and stood in the doorway for a moment before she looked up, and found him there. She rose immediately. "Sit down," he said. His voice was the same low level she had catalogued. There was something in it she had not heard before. She sat down. He came 3 steps into the corridor and stopped, and looked at the mend in the glove, and then at her hands holding it, and then at her face, and there was no composure left in his expression at all, only the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive, and has no guidance for what to do upon arrival. "I owe you a very particular debt," he said. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I did my duty. You did considerably more than your duty." He was quiet for a moment. "She is talking to me now. My wife is talking to me as though I am a person, rather than an arrangement, which I had not experienced before from her, and had begun to believe was not in the contract of our marriage." The faint crease between his brows deepened slightly. "That is your doing." "It is hers, Your Grace. She is braver than she appears." "Yes," he said. "She is." He looked at her. "So are you." She was aware of the smallness of the corridor. She was aware of the quality of the afternoon light, the particular December gray of it at the window, laying itself across the flagstone floor in a pale, precise rectangle. She was aware of the distance between them, which was 6 feet, and of the fact that he had not closed it, and of the fact that she had not moved, and of the fact that her heartbeat was audible in a way she found somewhat inconvenient. "I spoke with my mother," he said. Nell was careful. "I hope her ladyship is well, Your Grace. She told me she had spoken to you. I want you to know that her concern, whatever form it took, was not sanctioned by me." A pause. "And that her assessment of the situation was not accurate." Her hands were still in her lap. She did not permit them to tell him anything. "I am aware," he said quietly, "of what is appropriate and what is not. I am not a man who is confused on that point. Another pause. Longer. I am also aware that there are questions I have no good answer to at present, because the answers require a kind of honesty that will take more time than I have had. I am asking you, Miss Hargrove, to allow me that time. She looked at him. His face was the face she had catalogued in the entrance hall and the gallery and the study, and it was entirely different from any of those iterations. It was unguarded in a way she had not seen before except for the single instant in the study after she had told him to go to his wife. And she understood, with the steady precision she had inherited from a curate who had believed in examining things as they actually were, that she was being asked something, and being asked it by a man who was not accustomed to asking. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. She meant that too. The winter settled over Ashford Park in the days after Christmas. The household quieted. The stone of the old chapel was white with frost. The graves in the small churchyard held their silence, as graves do, waiting for the living to find some arrangement with what they meant. On the 1st of January, Lady Ashford departed for Bath, citing the benefit of the waters to her constitution, which the household understood to mean that she had recalibrated and was withdrawing to do so with dignity. The morning room was her room. She left it, and the house was different in her absence, not emptier but less arranged, as though the furniture had permission now to settle into its natural positions rather than the ones assigned to it. The Duchess, in February, began to play the pianoforte in the music room in the late afternoons. It was a small thing, a private thing. The choice of a woman who had spent 6 months performing in every room of the house, and had found one room where she did not have to. The Duke was heard to pause in the corridor outside it on Tuesday afternoons, not entering, simply listening. The passage between them was not fully mapped yet. It was being mapped. Slowly, with the care that difficult terrain required. Nell understood these things as she moved through the house that winter. She understood them the way she understood the house itself, by attending to signs rather than declarations, by trusting the accumulation of small specific things over the weight of any single gesture. Her sister Cecily came to stay for a fortnight in March, small and dark and curious about everything, asking questions about the house with the frank appetite of a 12-year-old who found every corner of it magnificent. The Duke encountered them once in the South Gallery, Nell and Cecily examining a portrait of an Ashford ancestor in hunting dress, and he stopped to identify the horse in the portrait by name, which was a thing Nell had not known he would do, and Cecily was delighted. And Nell watched his face while he spoke to her sister with a patient gravity that cost him nothing and gave the child everything. And she felt something shift behind her ribs that was not precisely new, but was newly acknowledged. He looked up at her over Cecily's head. The gray eyes were direct and warm and entirely honest. She did not look away. In April, on a morning when the estate grounds were beginning to green from a hard winter, he came to where she was walking at the edge of the kitchen garden with her cloak on against the April cold, and he fell into step beside her. And they walked along the garden wall in a silence that was not the silence of constraint, but the silence of two people who have arrived, through a great deal of indirect routes, at the same place. "I have spoken to Crane," he said at last, "and to Lady Catherine." He did not elaborate on what had been said, and she did not ask, and she understood from the care in his voice that what had been said with the honesty she had come to expect from him. Full and unsparing and quiet. She waited. "You told me, in November," he said, "that a person cannot begin to trust what they have not been given." "Yes, Your Grace." "I am giving you this," he said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The kitchen garden held its frost at the wall base. the last of it, the pale remnant of a hard season. He turned to look at her with the undisguised attention she had first seen in the study, and had carried since then as a small, precise weight inside her chest. "I am giving you what I have. I am aware it is not a simple thing to receive." She looked at his face. She thought about the wall that had opened in November, the cold air and the stone smell, the passage running dark and purposeful to what it needed to reach. She thought about what it took to carry a secret through a house alone and what it cost to lay it down. She thought about the girl in the boarding house in Derbyshire who was 12 years old and had looked at a duke as though he were simply a man who knew the name of a horse in a painting and had been treated accordingly. "James," she said. She had not used his name before. It was a transgression, in the fullest Regency sense of that word. And she was a curate's daughter, and she knew what transgressions cost. The look on his face told her she had given him something in exchange for the thing she could see he was about to give her. He took her gloved hand in both of his. He did not speak. He simply held her hand in the April cold, in the kitchen garden of the estate, with the frost at the wall base and the green beginning in the ground around it. And she let him. And the morning was very quiet, and the house behind them breathed the way old houses breathe, as though it had been waiting for exactly this, and had been patient about the waiting, and was now content. She had not meant to find it. She had meant only to carry the warming pan. But here was what she had found instead. A woman verifying her trust in the dark. A man learning to lay down the silence he had used instead of grief. And a passage that had run forgotten through the stone for a generation, waiting for someone to walk it all the way through. The first warm morning of spring, Nell Hargrove walked out to the chapel with her mistress. They stood at Elizabeth Elliot's grave together, and neither of them said anything. And after a while, the Duchess laid a sprig of rosemary against the stone, and they walked back together through the new green of the Ashford Park grounds, and the house received them both, and the passage behind the panel was still there. But no one needed it anymore. It had done its work. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments. There are more like it, told with the same care, waiting whenever you are ready.